Thank you all so much for coming to the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at Portland State University. My name is Mariana Ramirez, and I'm the director of the JSMA, and I'm so excited to welcome you here on this rainy, dreary day, so thank you for joining us. Today is our third and final talk featuring artists who were recently added to the PSU art collection. Previously, we had Srijan Chowdhury 2 weeks ago and Ellen Lesperance last week. And today we have Venancio de la Paz. And I chose these three artists because their work touches on themes found in our current exhibition, Louise Bourgeois, What is the Shape of This Problem?, from the collections of Jordan D. Schnitzer and his family foundation. Bourgeois was born in Paris in 1911, and her family ran a tapestry restoration shop. It was here that Bourgeois started her artistic journey, drawing designs for missing pieces in damaged tapestries. The weavers would follow her designs when mending the tapestries. Throughout this exhibition, Bourgeois plays with the ideas of textiles, printing and reproductions, mixing and melding different mediums. We're welcoming Venancio de la Paz here today as an artist that also likes to play, experiment, and investigate the relationships between textiles and other mediums and machines. De la Paz's work and research is situated within the unfolding relationship between ancient weaving technology, the loom, and modern computers. PSU acquired 5 works by De La Paz: Ditheren 1.1, 1.6, 1.7, and 3.1, and Redaction 1.0 and 1.1, all created in 2018. We acquired these through Oregon's Percent for Art in Public Places program, managed by the Oregon Arts Commission. While the museum does not collect art, the university has an art collection of over 300 works that are on display across campus. De La Paz's work is on view in the new Vanport building. Support for this series of talks is provided by the Ford Family Foundation. Art in Louise Bourgeois, What is the Shape of This Problem?, is from the collections of Jordan D. Schnitzer and his family foundation, and funding to support this exhibition and programming is from Jordan Schnitzer through the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation. Venancio de la Paz is an artist, writer, and educator. His work explores the intersection of textile processes such as weaving, dyeing, and stitch work as they relate to broader concerns of language, histories of colonization, migrancy, ancient technologies, and speculative futures. Interested in the ways transient or ephemeral experiences are embodied in material, De La Paz looks to how knowledge and experiences are transmitted through society in space and time, whether semiotically by language or haptically by made things. He is currently assistant professor and curricular head of fibers at the University of Oregon. Please join me in welcoming Venancio de la Paz.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mariana, for that introduction. It's quite surreal to hear my own name in the same breath as Louise Bourgeois. So it's quite an honor to speak in this room with her extraordinary works. I'd like to thank the JSMA and PSU for bringing me here. I'd also like to thank Mariana, Shelley, Allison, and Stephen for organizing my visit. It's been such a joy already, and I'm looking forward to meeting with students in the weaving program here later today. So I'll talk about my work, of course, but I'm also going to include a few references to my biography, some references to things that have inspired my research and my thinking. These things range from science fiction to ecological concerns to the history of computing. And then there will be a short period of time, I believe, at the end for your questions. So just a little bit about myself. I was born in Singapore and quickly immigrated with my family to rural Oregon in 1987. This is a view outside of my bedroom window. I haven't seen my parents in quite a long time because of the pandemic, but yeah, it was quite a shocking shift for us coming from very populous Southeast Asia, Jakarta and Singapore, to admittedly very bucolic and rural Oregon. It was a great place to grow up in many ways. These are all images from Google Maps of my neighborhood. It's much less rural now. It's been developed quite significantly over the last couple decades. But yeah, beautiful place, but also really fraught with a kind of, I think, violence that exists for people of color, for queer people in the rural parts of our country. So, I had a very interesting mixed experience there. This is the mega church that my family went to. I was the target of a lot of violence, and it was challenging. And in many ways, this reality forced me to turn inwards, and so I spent a lot of time alone on the computer. And people often ask me, because my work is so related to technology, so much of the concerns around tech today are concerns that are quite expansive. We're thinking about ecology, we're thinking about the effect of all of these screens on our lives. But for me, the experience of technology was very personal. This was sort of how I spent my time growing up. Science fiction, computer games, these things were very important to me because I think I needed other worlds. The world that was sort of presented to me as a young queer person of color was very uncertain and scary. So I needed other worlds as a kind of survival. This is a piece, an older body of work, a weaving, which is created following descriptions of a textile in Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed. In the scene in which it is described, it's like a tapestry in an interstellar spaceship. And this was very interesting to me. I weave with a digital jacquard loom, which allows the maker, designers and artists to produce any imagery, any imagery, photographic, text-based imagery. And so I was always asking myself, what is worth weaving on a piece of technology that can weave anything? And this piece really began an inquiry for me into science fiction and speculative fiction as an avenue to sort of imagine the future, future worlds which we wish to exist in, but also warnings about our future. So, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Le Guin's novel, but it has much to do with labor and labor rights, and this textile is sort of in the background. It is a piece of art imagined in the future, and I wove it primarily based on there isn't like a passage in the novel that says, there are these circles and these stripes, but sort of as an act of world building, sort of analyzing her text, the civilization she was imagining, looking at color language throughout the book to sort of create this work. This is another piece from that series. This is a textile. The image is quite small. This was woven based on descriptions of a textile in Philip K. Dick's novella, The Last of the Masters, which sort of imagines a future world in which humans have forgotten how to make things, and everything is produced by machines, by sort of advanced technology and artificial intelligence. I had the very curious opportunity to display this piece in the office of our governor, Kate Brown, through a very special program that brings various local artists into her ceremonial office space. So here's the piece, and it is situated within this sort of vignette. Other objects, thinking about objects that sort of represent our colonial history in the Northwest, but also this particularly curious object. I know you can't read the text, so I'll go ahead and read it. But I'm referring in the text to this vitrine, which is in the front. You can see my weaving, part of my weaving in the background. And this is the text. This vitrine, which is lined with gold leaf and silk cloth, contains fragments of the lunar surface collected by American astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong during the Apollo 11 mission. The 4 fragments weigh about 0.05 grams in total, Included in the display is a diminutive synthetic fabric representation of the Oregon state flag, which traveled to the moon with the crew of the Apollo 11 for this specific symbolic purpose. The lunar rocks and flag were given to the state of Oregon by then President Richard Nixon in 1965. Actually, Nixon was not president in 65, so that's a typo. Similar lunar samples displays were gifted to all 50 states of the Union, as well as all countries recognized as legitimate governments of the world. The small plaque reads, "This fragment is a portion of a rock from the Taurus-Littrow Valley of the Moon. It is given as a symbol of the unity of human endeavor and carries with it the hope of the American people for a world at peace." So a very beautiful symbolic gesture. But I was so excited by this pairing because I think it very succinctly illustrates a kind of conundrum that I face, and I think many people face with the role of technology. And that is, technology of all kinds tends to carry with it on the surface our highest ideals. You know, we see this frequently now, I believe, in tech, where our problems of fossil fuels, our problems of anxiety, all these problems will be solved through technology. But in the same sort of breath, technology also is constantly carrying with it kind of a threat of our own destruction, a threat of destruction of the planet. As you know, we did not travel to the moon for such generous purposes. We traveled to the moon as an act of supreme US power against the Soviet Union. So this theme, I think, continues through all of my work, that technology carries with it these ideals, but also carries with it the sort of imminent possibility of violence or destruction. I said I would talk about science fiction. So this is a scene from a film, Star Trek Enterprise. I believe the name of the film is, does anyone know? It's escaping me right now. Insurrection. And in it, you can see Jean-Luc Picard. He's admiring, oh, it's very hard to see, isn't it? Can you see that at all? It's quite dark. So I'll just describe what's happening. Jean-Luc Picard is there. He's admiring a textile, and he says, "This is extraordinary craftsmanship." And the character to his left says, "It's the work of students." She says, "They're almost ready to become apprentices. In 30 or 40 years, some of them will take their place among the artisans." And Jean-Luc Picard says very wistfully, "Apprenticing for 30 years." In this narrative, the crew of the Enterprise encounters these beings who live extraordinarily long lives, and with those lives, they explore and develop themselves physically, spiritually, technologically. And I show this because I had the very interesting experience of going to a craft conference in Virginia several years ago. And this was not like an academic kind of craft conference. This was a conference of primarily Etsy entrepreneurs. And the keynote speakers were two individuals, two designers and artists who make props and do set design for science fiction. And they were talking about how curious it is when they design the set, say, for the office, Jean-Luc Picard's office on the Starship Enterprise, how they have to imagine the visual language and visual art of the future. Right? You know, we are so often engaged as artists and designers about thinking about our present. Right? We make work reflective of our present, but their job was to imagine art in the future. And I found this to be a very interesting conundrum. And so they went on to talk about how when they do set design, one of the main references that keeps coming up in science fiction, film, media, TV, is mid-century modernism. So this is a scene, a very famous scene from Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, where we see very, very emphasized the gin chairs and the tulip table of Ilya Saarinen, both mid-century modern designers, but somehow projected, hundreds of years into the future. We see this repeated in other science fiction films. This is a scene from Solaris, which is, has been remade since, but in the original, film, we can see here again the Eliel Saarinen's tulip table. This is very curious to me. The question is why mid-century modernism, a modern design of the 50s and 60s, why is this so frequently used as a vernacular to describe the future? And one theory is that these designers of the 50s, 60s, and 70s were not working to describe the present moment. They were envisioning a kind of utopic design of the future, right? So still today we have inherited the sense that mid-century modernism has this sort of futuristic feel. I just saw the film Dune a few days ago, and it holds up there as well. This is a scene from Gattaca with Ethan Hawke, and a building that is very prominent in that film is the Civic Center of Marin County by Frank Lloyd Wright. And if you've ever been there, yes, it's an extremely sort of futuristic setting. So we see this trope repeated again and again, but I think something very important to note is that these settings of the future rarely are occupied by people of color, for example. So in many ways, this sort of imagining of the future is a particular imagination of whiteness and of access and of affluence. So the question then becomes, who in our narratives is speculating about the future? What are their embodiments and what are their biases? I think this is very important when we talk about science fiction and imagining the future. What are the identities of those who are creating this imagination? I think it's, just because I'm a Stanley Kubrick fan, so I think it's very important, that at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, I won't give anything away. It sort of ends in this kind of surreal space in which Baroque and Rococo artworks replace the mid-century modern aesthetic. And so it's sort of like a return in many ways from this sort of 2.5 hours of sleek, minimal spaces to this kind of almost grotesque Rococo space, a kind of return to the body. And that's reflected in images like the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, in which the sort of spiritual experience is expressed through physicality. Just an aside. My favorite character, I think, in science fiction is the HAL robot in 2001: A Space Odyssey, a kind of supercomputer that takes on all of the functions of the spaceship. And I think I have this interesting relationship with the TC2 loom, this digital loom, which I utilize in my own work. I often have this fantasy of, like in Philip K. Dick's novelette, The Last of the Masters, sort of a question of if machines were allowed to make artwork on their own, what would they make? So this question is just one that is always in the back of my mind. In terms of understanding this machine, this digital TC2 Jacquard loom, I want to give some context around the history of weaving technology. So this is Joseph Marie Jacquard, an inventor. And he is often credited, though he utilized the work and research of many other inventors before him. He sort of revolutionized weaving in the Industrial Revolution by creating the Jacquard loom. And Jacquard's primary observation of the loom is that patterns in textile can be described in binary code. He didn't call it binary code, but he found a way to translate weaving patterns into punch cards in which wherever there is a hole, a thread can come up. Wherever there's no hole, a thread stays down. This is a binary system, 1 and 0, on and off, up and down. So in his loom, this is an engraving of a Jacquard loom from the 18th century in New York, actually. You can see the punch cards up here. They're fed into the brain of the machine. These cords are not part of the textile, but they're part of the loom, and they control individual threads to come up or stay down such that the weaving pattern emerges. Another aside, at the University of Oregon, every other summer, except during the current pandemic, We actually bring students to the Licio Foundation in Florence, Italy, which is a preeminent jacquard weaving studio. And there, we get to see really extraordinary examples of this technology in action. The patterns are enormous sort of stacks of cards, and it's data. This is data embodied in material. The whole building is designed as a renovated nunnery, and it was retrofitted with ramps so they could move all this data from basement storage to the looms themselves. And I like to think about this because we have kind of a fantasy, I think, of data as sort of disembodied or immaterial. I look at Wikipedia on my phone, I do my banking on my computer. But this is quite a fallacy, right? Data is always physical and always embodied. Most of it, like Facebook, for example, Google have massive data centers in Eastern Oregon that utilize huge amounts of fossil fuels for air conditioning, et cetera. So I like to show this as a way to think about data as embodied, right? We have a fantasy only that it is immaterial or disembodied. It's a really extraordinary experience to see these machines. We tend also to think about technology as always moving towards sleek, kind of silent, airless. When things go wrong with our computers, we know because they're making these loud noises, and that's bad. But these machines are industrial. They produce huge amounts of sound, and the whole experience of the weaving process is really physical. Here I am, very excited about my pattern. So in Licio, we design in traditional gouache. It's then translated into point paper, which can then be translated into numerical strings of numbers, that are then translated into punch cards. Here I am weaving. You can see an example of the textile. Of course, I bring all this up to say that the punch card loom, the jacquard punch card loom, is in many ways the direct precursor to the IBM punch card computer. So this is the IBM 100, which is a computer programmed entirely through punch cards. And it's good to remember that its total memory capacity is a minuscule fraction of what's in our iPhones. It's basically like a glorified calculator. So, I fall down these rabbit holes when I'm researching the histories of these technologies. There are incredible stories. In a future time, I'd love to tell you, but suffice to say, this process of programming the punch cards through the sort of binary system, it's almost indistinguishable from the way jacquard loom punch cards were programmed. So you can see on the left here is a jacquard loom punch card, and then on the right is an IBM early punch card. Of course, today our computers are not run by punch cards of any kind. They're run by microchips which send binary signals, right? So it sends bursts of electricity. If there's a burst, that's like a hole in the punch card. If there's no burst, that's no hole. Again, a binary system. So as I was researching all of this, I became very interested in sort of having a deeper relationship with the digital loom. Typically the way the loom is used is like in Photoshop, you bring in a photograph, it does all this translation for you, and then you put it into the loom software, and it basically creates your textile. With my students, they want to weave photos of their hamsters or their cat. I think that's wonderful. But I was interested in trying to create my own software to sort of more directly engage the loom without sort of thinking about it just as like an output, like a glorified printer, essentially. So I began studying how to code. I'm not a programmer. My code is very, very simple. But with it, I began exploring questions about how do we conceive of cloth at the loom, right? Again, I apologize, this the images are a little bit on the dark side. So with this early body of work, with this software, which I called WeaveWriter, I was playing with the idea of weavability. Like, what can be woven? What are the sort of extreme edges of what this computerized loom can produce? And so I won't go through all of the textiles individually, but I was creating software that sort of was like drawing into this software, which was always trying to respond directly to my gesture. You know, I'm using like a stylus on a what are those called, Wacom tablet, you know, and the software was sort of trying to translate my gesture directly into weave pattern. In other instances, I was interested in this function in the TC2 software in which the computer is always trying to correct your weave design errors. So it's a very basic function. When my students are designing their projects, for example, there are moments that the computer tells you, oh, this is unweavable. You can't do that. Let me correct it for you. So I thought this was very interesting. An algorithm is sort of giving its input on my students' creativity. And I wanted to maximize on that idea. So let me define unweavable for a moment. The computer software needs very, very clear instructions, lots of detailed instructions in order to translate the imagery into a weaving. So I was giving the computer almost no information. I would make a very simple line drawing, right, with huge areas that are empty or void of information. And so then I would ask the computer, fill in the rest, you know, sort of like a collaborator doing this kind of back and forth. So in this piece, I've just drawn one sort of zigzag line, and the computer has sort of populated the rest of the textile with its own sort of computational creativity, we can call it. And this is very interesting to me. So in many ways, a lot of the formal decisions I make are not directly specified by me. A lot of the formal decisions become a collaboration with this piece of software. And so really, unexpected things begin to emerge. Programmers like to call these ghosts in the machine, right? Sort of errant behaviors that are unpredictable. And I can capture these as physical experiences embodied in cloth. There's a lot of detail happening in here. There's a lot of interesting choices the computer ends up making. This is always a challenging transition for me to make. But you know, as I was researching the history of computer technology and the history of computers and programming, I came across this narrative which just sort of, I didn't know what to do with it. I think often artists, you come across an experience in your life or in reading, whatever it is, and it sort of lodges somewhere in your brain and just sort of stays there for many years. But I come across this story about this computer, which is a supercomputer located in New Jersey at the Institute for Advanced Studies. And the story goes like this. During the Second World War, it was realized that when the bomb, the nuclear bomb was designed, we didn't know what would happen exactly. It was sort of like, yeah, it's going to be big, but we don't know the extent. It could destroy the planet, could destroy a continent, etc. So the US government engaged computer scientists and said, make a computer powerful enough to calculate what will happen when we drop the bomb in Japan. So a most sort of terrible purpose, but the scientists were very good at their job. They produced the computer. They were able to calculate the blast yield of the bomb. It was big, but it was not so big that the government wasn't going to use it. And these are some of the programmers of that computer. And so after they accomplished this sort of most terrible task, the government was essentially like, we don't know what to do with this computer. They used it a little bit to calculate trajectories of missiles, et cetera, but essentially the army, they were done with this powerful computer. And they told the scientists, who I always like to mention were primarily women, what should, take this computer and do what you think is best with it. So they're like, oh gosh, we have the world's most powerful computer. We should open it to the scientific community to sort of determine, basically send us your unsolvable questions, your unsolvable problems, and we'll try and help you solve them. And they chose the work of this fellow, Niels Ahl Barichelli, who was a Swedish and Italian mathematician and biologist. And he was interested in trying to make a visual model or model mathematically Darwin's theory of evolution. So he wanted to see, how do single-cell organisms evolve over time? How do they create communities? How do they survive destruction? And so the proximity of these two projects, that this one computer in one instance was used to create the most devastating force of destruction our species has ever imagined, was then immediately used to ask questions about the origin of life and the survivability of life, was so profound to me. Sort of these two, Genesis and Apocalypse, sort of lodged right in the center of this machine. So Barichelli went to New Jersey. He worked on these models. This is this is his paper, his original paper, which shows a variety of things. I don't understand all the math, I have to say, but this caused me to work with a collaborator who I'll talk about a bit more, a programmer named Michael Mack. We read the paper, we tried to understand it as best we could, and we reprogrammed it to work on the TC2 loom. So basically, in this diagram, Barichelli called his organisms bionumeric organisms. They were virtual, single-celled organisms. Each had its own personality. Each had a specific way of interacting with its neighbors. And it's hard to see in this image, but basically what he would get is a printout, a sort of a map, a genealogy of how each generation of single-celled organisms would interact. And the final result would be a printout that had patterns very much like this. When I saw this, my mind immediately went to textile. Basically, if you are a weaver, you know that you build the cloth, you accrete the cloth layer by layer, weft pick by weft pick, thread by thread. And so Barichelli's software was working exactly the same way. It was sort of building this record of these organisms line by line. And so the translation to the computer was actually very simple. And this is what the textile looks like. Essentially, let's see, if you can see a little area like this, there's a sort of white rectangle here, and there's another one here. This is a single-celled organism, and it has a specific way that it interacts with its neighbors. And so over time, you can see like this, oh, this is a group of orange single-celled organisms. They're doing very well. They're sort of taking over. Here's a really successful blue organism that is sort of growing on this side. I could share with you what the software looks like. It's on this computer. But basically, the way we solved this issue of translating Barichelli's numerical organism into a pattern, a weavable pattern, was we began dressing each single-celled organism in a weave structure costume. That's the best way I can describe it. So, they can wear all kinds of costumes. This is an industrial satin. It looks like this, multicolored satin. Here's the same costume. This is in wool. Here's another costume. This is a single-colored damask textile. So we were dressing these single-celled organisms in different patterns so that they could grow and we can capture their activities in cloth. There's a lot of technical information that I could go into, and I enjoy going into, but for the sake of this talk, I'll leave it at that. In exhibition, these textiles tend to become almost like topographies, that they can be navigated very physically in space. I tend to work in relationship both in relation to the wall and to the floor, trying to navigate both the sort of cognitive or visual space of the wall, but also the physical embodied space of the floor. This is the programmer, Michael Mack, who I spent a lot of time with. It's amazing to collaborate, I think, in any instance, but to collaborate with someone who seems on the surface so far afield from my own field was such a rich experience. You know, his understanding of the mathematics of Baricelli's original paper allowed us to ask questions that I would never have the knowledge to know how to think about, or even to ask, right? So he noticed, oh, because that supercomputer actually had very limited memory, Baricelli could only ask certain questions. Basically, Baricelli was looking for harmony, right? How do these single-cell organisms survive over time? But Michael said, oh, we have the computing power, we can ask it. What about aggression, right? What about greed? Can we program these single-celled organisms to have different kinds of attitudes towards each other? And so, you know, in an amazing way, we were able to sort of extend Baricelli's research sort of beyond the 1950s and ask sort of different kinds of questions. Beyond that technical, though, it was amazing to work with a programmer as skilled as Michael, because in so many ways, again, it seems that these fields are so far apart, right? The weaving and computer technology. Of course, the machines, through binary code and through that history, are very linked. But in a physical way, seeing him work at the computer is like watching a craftsperson work, right? Though they're not working with material, they're working with language and numbers and moving these things around in a virtual space. I see it very, very similarly to how I see my colleagues and my students work in the studio as well. And I always think the more we can sort of see similarities between our fields, the more opportunities there are to ask questions that just as a weaver and an artist, I don't know how to ask. So the software we developed based on Baricelli's original software was called BioLoom 1.0. These are some examples of the finished products. These were at Holding Contemporary Gallery, I want to say a year ago, but it's not even a year ago, over the summer, I believe. In reading more about the influence of the IAS Institute for Advanced Studies Computer and Baricelli's research, I found this bit of text. You know, I had a hard time knowing what to do with these. It's like, should they be flat on a table? Do they become garments? What are these textiles in the end? There was this amazing quote by a historian of computer technology named George Dyson, and he said that Baricelli's visualizations are abstractions of Darwin's theory of evolution, visual abstractions. And so that language, I was so excited to read that bit of language because, you know, many of you know proto-abstractionists like Lee Krasner, you know, there was an idea that you can only abstract from life, like abstraction must come from somewhere, and these were direct descriptions of living organisms, you know, digital organisms, but for my purposes, they're very alive. So I took on this language of geometric abstraction, of formal abstraction. I gave these textiles sort of large fields of blank space. In many ways, it's hard to talk about this quality, but it's a felt kind of intuition that these are alive. I want to give them space, visual space. I think it also helps the viewer. They tend to be very dense visually, and so these empty spaces, I think, became opportunities for the viewer to rest the eye and reflect on some of these qualities. This piece on the left is called An Ocean for Eloise. And people often ask me, so you're working with biology, you're thinking about survival, you certainly must have some ecologic, political position that is embedded in these works. And you know, as a human on this planet today, of course, I have ecological concerns. And I think that they're explored, though, through a kind of reflection on the technology and a reflection on sort of the history of technology and where it's sort of leading us and how we can sort of imagine different possibilities for the future. You know, there's, again, the way in which technology holds both our ideals our sort of highest ideals and sort of threat of imminent destruction. These are very, very close, I think, in the way we explore technology. And this piece is called An Ocean for Eloise. It's indigo dyed. It uses the same software as I've been describing, this BioLoom Baricelli software. And I had this funny opportunity that a dear friend of mine brought her daughter to the weaving studio, and Eloise was very excited by it, and she's like, "Oh, can I try that loom?" I was like, "Oh yes, it's $100,000, but yes, please feel free to try it." And so she was weaving there. It was a very special kind of experience. But I show this imagery in relationship to the questions of ecology because Eloise is 8, and marine biologists tell us that in 27 years, when she's my age today, we will live on a planet with oceans void of fish and marine life. And so there is like a zero date associated. And I don't tell this story, I think, to provoke hopelessness. I tell this story because I think as an artist, I want to invite reflection on how we might be able to think it through technology in a more intimate and productive way, as opposed to the sort of passive consumerism, which I think tech has really promoted in our culture. So that within kind of the void or the sort of hopelessness that technology, as it grows so far beyond our means to understand it and control it, that when we invite sort of closer introspective look, and it is a turning inwards and in thinking about our relationship to technology, that perhaps more information can be revealed that we haven't yet even begun to have conversation about. This piece, which is a partner piece to the Ocean for Eloise, it is a specific parameter of the BioLoom software that reached a mass extinction point. So there was a moment where most of the organisms had died off. You can see in the center, but they returned. They found a sort of a way to survive this mass extinction in their digital world. So I don't want to say too much about. I've said a lot already about the relationship between these two pieces, but I think artists, we can tell these stories, and we can sort of look into a kind of place which neither technology alone nor consumers alone can reveal. I'm going to finish up with just a current project. In so many ways, what occurs in the digital, as I've described as kind of utopic or idealistic vision, so often in lived experience doesn't work that way, or technology is very unpredictable. And so this is a very simple analysis of that. When we go to the loom to weave a design, we have to worry about a problem which many people experience through video, screen-based work, called aspect ratio, right? It's sort of like images pixels are not always square. They get pulled and pushed in different directions. And to solve that problem, we weave a test strip of circles at the loom. And what is causing this sort of stretching and compression is the thickness of the weft yarn, right? So in the ideal space of the computer, everything is perfect grid, everything is square, everything is 90 degrees. But in the lived experience of weaving, thread is not sort of perfect or only orthogonal, right? Thicker thread causes the circle to stretch, and thinner thread causes it to compress. And so, exploring this very simple idea, I think has this quality of asking the question of how we deal with our ideals in the digital versus the sort of fallibility of our physical experience. That's kind of interesting. I have been looking at the Louise Bourgeois installation behind you all and feeling a very strong kind of connection there. This piece is called An Ode to Forgetting. And I think it is appropriate. I believe in thinkers like Carl Sagan and Donna Haraway, who say that to survive our technological adolescence, which we are in now. I don't know if you all remember being an adolescent, but it's sort of that period where it's very awkward, right? The body of our technology is exceeding our ability to sort of control it. But the way we cultivate that survival through our technological adolescence is not by cutting off technology. The Luddites were weavers. This is a very, very close kind of history to me. But that we have to build a more intimate relationship with technology. And to think about it not as sort of something which we are constantly adversarial with, but something that it extends our potential to think and to dream and to write a collaborative future. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Havencio. One of the first questions I have, actually, have you named your loom?
Yes. It's not my loom. It's the University of Oregon's loom.
Sure.
We call it Barbara.
Okay.
And that's in memory, in honor of the sort of founder of the weaving program at the University of Oregon. Her name is Barbara Pickett. And she actually is the person who developed this relationship with the Licio Foundation in Florence that we bring students to. She is a really renowned weaver known for jacquard weaving.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? While they're thinking, one thing I have a question about what about current science fiction? Is there anything you're currently reading right now?
Yeah. So I am working a lot with artificial intelligence, which is challenging, primarily because there are a lot of copyrights and intellectual property around artificial intelligences. But I've been working with an AI developed by NVIDIA, who produces graphic memory chips. They're very known in the gaming world. But basically, they've created an AI which generates landscapes from very simple line drawings. So that you can input a very simple drawing and it'll produce a landscape based on your parameters. And I've been using it to create these very long tapestries, which are like digital, endless non-places. And they're sort of responding to an exhibition at the JSMA in U of O, the Beberini tapestries, which are huge tapestries of the 17th, 18th century, which are sort of retellings of colonial exploits, right? So I'm sort of thinking about, about the history of colonization and how we hope to engage and cultivate the digital landscape, which is, constantly in front of us. I can't quite.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I love learning just your perspective on art and technology and the relationship between humans and technology. That's something that I really ponder on and invested in, building a future where we are in harmony with technology. And I can't wait to explore more of your art. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Was there a question up here?
I have a question about WeaveWriter and BioLoom.
Yes.
Are those available for the public?
Great question.
Yeah.
They are available in a sense. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is this inaccessibility of working with a lot of these technologies. So, the TC Tulum, as I mentioned, it's $100,000. Only institutions can own them. That seems like a problem. I think innovation comes from mass collaboration, that lots of minds need to be working with these tools, with these ideas. So I'm working actually with a different programmer in London to write a software that's, I don't know if you remember MS Paint. Do people remember MS Paint? It's like pixel art. It was in every Windows computer that you purchased for decades. It's sort of an MS Paint for weaving. So very intuitive. Someone can just draw and a textile is the result of that drawing. So a lot of the research in BioLoom and in WeaveWriter is the foundation of that software. It's an ongoing process. The interesting thing is, the hope is that people would be able to access these looms in a cloud-based format. All of these looms have the ability to be connected directly to an Ethernet plug and can be accessed remotely. So that sounds exciting. Like, I like the idea of Weaver in Turkey plugging into the loom in the University of Oregon and working collaboratively in that way.
You had mentioned a little bit when you were talking about some of your influences, about how, earlier sci-fi really left out the narratives of people of color. I'm curious if there's anything that you've been doing within your own work to kind of rethink about the futurism or inserting people of color into the narrative.
Yeah, a curator I really recommend, if you're interested in this subject, her name is Astria Suparak. She's in the Bay Area. She is directly engaged in sort of thinking about Orientalism in science fiction and has a great project, a screen-based project that's sort of looking at moments in modern science fiction that are void of the people whose cultures are being referenced. In my own work, I'm not so engaged, I think, in kind of a simplistic solution to that. I think, I know writers and people who are in film who are definitely working on, science fiction as a platform to talk about indigeneity, colonialism, et cetera. I think that for me personally, supporting their work has been, engaging them in their work has been the primary way, which I, as a cultural producer, have been thinking about these things. But in another way, I think that it's sort of like making the software, as I was describing earlier, I think is one way in which, the tools of speculation need to be in different hands, right? So language, writing, narrative is one tool of speculation. A software like this is also a tool of speculation. Adobe, for example, we think of as a very passive or neutral kind of entity through which so many of our students, so many artists sort of funnel their resources in order to create the visual experiences that they do. I would like more people of different identities to learn coding and to create greater access to that skill, which is going to be essential for democratizing the way we imagine future technologies. It's a big question. It's a big question, and it requires ongoing analysis.
Well, thank you very much. Were there any other questions? Oh, another one back here.
I appreciated you sharing that story about Eloise and your ecological concerns. And I was just wondering, do you have thoughts about whether and how artists can have measurable impact on climate change?
That really is the million-dollar question, I think, not only for artists, but for anyone. What are the measurable things we can do as individuals to affect change at this global kind of scale? I think that, I'm an artist and a weaver. I see the world, understand the world through these particular skills. I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know what the steps will be in those fields to sort of affect change. But as I said earlier, I think that artists are very good at speculating and dreaming of how future might be. And I think that Jacques Rancière, in his text, The Knights of Labor, talks about revolution needing all kinds of perspectives. Like, we can't have a unilateral approach to solving climate change, for example. It needs artists, it needs poets, it needs scientists, it needs consumers, it needs politicians, it needs lawyers, right? And I think that the measurable change comes from that collectivity, right? It's not just about putting all of our eggs in one basket. We have to cultivate, I think, a broad culture of concern to stay with that trouble, as Donna Haraway would say. Thank you.
Helvencio, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. And can we all give him another round of applause?
Thank you.